So, welcome to the first lecture to go with Chapter 1. I'm going to talk today primarily about the communication model, which is a great visual way to help you understand all of the different elements that go into successfully communicating, not only in a business context, but really in any context. But this is a tremendously helpful way to help you visualize and understand all the different elements that we're looking at this semester. Before I do that, though, in this presentation, I would like to briefly say a few words about employer and employee perspectives. The employability and the ability to succeed in the workplace and the ability to have a better time in the workplace as a function of your ability to communicate is hard to overstate. And so I'm just going to repeat a bit of what the book has to say here. And then we're going to explore the communication model in some depth. I like the one that the book has, but I thought that I could come up with something a little bit clearer and that discusses a couple of the elements that the book skips over. And so we'll talk about that. But this is essentially the same communication model as laid out in Chapter 1 of the Newman textbook. So as I said, first we're going to talk about the perspectives on communication from the perspective of employers and employees. From the employer perspective, I just want to stress that the better you can communicate, the better you set yourself up for professional success. Now, most of you are probably thinking about getting that first job, as you should. That is certainly the first step in a successful career, is getting that first good professional job. But the difference that I want you to think about is not only the ability to look good in an interview, but the ability to succeed in the workplace in the weeks, months, and years after you get that first position. Because the better you can communicate, the more tactfully and deftly you can maneuver through every communication circumstance that you face, the more success you'll have professionally. There's just a really strong powerful correlation that would be really hard to overstate. And so don't just think about being ready to interview or being ready to send a good cover letter or a good follow-up email, all of which we'll talk about later in the semester. But think about all of the things that we're going to talk about this semester in the context of a real live workplace and how you would put this into practice or how you can put this into practice for those of you who are working already, and then how that can help contribute to your own success. But don't just think about it in terms of how do you achieve success perceptually, but how are you actually effective? And I really like this quote from Newman on page 5, which highlights some of the ways that you can be more or less effective. Employers and writing coaches say business school graduates tend to ramble, use pretentious vocabulary, or pen too casual emails. Now, these are just a few of the faux pas that we will also try to address throughout the semester, but I'll leave it to you to think about ways in which you could eliminate this in your daily life and start doing fewer of these things right now. One way in particular that I will invite you to do so is to consider using me as a recipient where you can practice a slightly more formal tone in your emails. Dear Dr. Herman or Dear Professor Herman versus Hey Bill would be a good first way to open an email in a more professional manner. Consider the language that you use in your emails. Make sure that you've at least given it a quick proofreading, and make sure that it's everything has proper spelling and grammar and punctuation. All of these elements lead to a more professional email, and just getting in that habit now when the stakes are low. In fact, the stakes are basically zero in this case, because you could say, hey Bill, and I will still help you, even though I will be a bit disappointed that you've not taken my advice here. You could use this as an opportunity to try to reach a more formal tone in your professional communication. Now, when it comes to your perspective selfishly, other than your employability and your success as somebody who seeks promotions or is desirable by other potential employers, I also want you to just think about the nature of your work life as an important part of your life. Now, this isn't something that Newman really emphasizes, but I want to emphasize this here. You will spend roughly a third of your waking hours at work. During the week, that's half of your waking hours at work, if not more. Many of you will be in professions, have positions that require even more hours out of your week, unless you're maybe pushing or achieving half of your waking hours thinking about work. And that's a lot of time. And we are social creatures. And so when you spend that much time with other people, then it's really important to have good relationships with those people. So you all have jobs to do, obviously. You're all going to have your own roles. It's going to be important to keep what your job is to do, to keep those roles in mind, to keep excellence at the workplace as an important goal, but also think about building up the relationships that you have in the workplace, because those personal relationships that you have at work are going to be incredibly important to you, even if they're not the same kinds of friendships that you have with your friends outside of work. Friendly or collegial relationships versus unhealthy, poorly communicated, toxic relationships with your colleagues. The difference between those two states of affairs is hard to overstate in terms of how comfortable and how excited you are to go to work every day. So with all of that out of the way, by way of just justifying the topic that we're going to talk about today, this semester, I want to focus most of this presentation on the idea of the communication model. And the key lesson here is that communication is a system. It's not merely a matter of, there's one or two or three elements of communication. It's a matter of there are so many things that go into communication, and you have to look at each of those pieces, each of those components in some detail to really understand what's happening if you want to understand an area of communication. And so you may be thinking, like a machine, is that the metaphor that we want to use? And actually the answer is no. With a machine, everything is precisely placed, everything is planned in advance, it all works together, there's one vision for how it all comes together, and none of that is a very good metaphor for communication. Instead, I want you to think of it more like an ecosystem. With an ecosystem, every organism has its own goals. Sometimes two organisms help each other, but sometimes they're at cross purposes. Every organism mostly has to work within a given context, but they can also sometimes have some effect on their broader environment. And there's no central plan, so you don't know how everything will interact until it starts. So these mushrooms and these grasses and these molds and the animals that are nearby and the microbes in the soil, they'll come together and do things together or in opposition to each other. But unlike a machine, there's no central plan, there's no design here. The stuff just happens, and the interaction between elements that have different incentives and different roles, sometimes working together, sometimes working at cross purposes, is a much better metaphor. So when we start thinking about the ecosystem of communication, a really simple model that starts with two elements is the sender and the receiver. The Newman book uses audience. That's obviously a fine word as well, but somebody who sends a message and somebody who receives a message or hears or takes in a message are the two basic elements that we start with before we build the other elements into thinking about the model. Now, what you want to ask is a lot of different questions about each of these different people. First of all, who is each person? What motives and expectations does each of these people bring to the table? What experience does each have with this kind of communication and with each other? Right? What is each of them going through at that moment? That's another important question you want to ask. That includes elements that are far outside of the context of the communication act that's taking place. For instance, imagine they're work colleagues, and the sender is in a great mood. They just bought a new car, yay, new car. And the receiver is upset because they just had a major blowout fight with their significant other. And obviously, arg, upset, anger, not in the mood. And this great mood and terrible mood, respectively, have nothing to do with the other person, have nothing to do with the communication that is taking place up until the communication starts, but obviously those can and often do shape the communication that takes place. So, what is the what is each where is each person at professionally, emotionally, mentally? Do they get enough sleep or too little sleep? Are they hungry? All of these things factor into the success or lack of success of a communication act. And finally, what's the long term nature of their relationship? Do they work well together? Are they constantly in disagreement? For instance, hypothetically, could one of them be a an incompetent manager with zero self awareness? And maybe the other has spent years humoring this incompetent manager through a slow simmering rage. Now, for those of you who don't watch The Office, the first picture is Michael Scott, as played by Steve Carell. He is the incompetent supervisor with very poor self-awareness. And the second is Stanley Hudson, as played by Leslie David Baker. He is one of the direct reports to Michael Scott's character, and just can't stand the guy because of his incompetence. Has nothing personal against him, but has a very sort of long-held seething resentment that this guy is in charge even though he doesn't know what he's doing. So these situations actually do happen in the workplace. Hopefully, your first supervisor is not a Michael Scott type, although there are arguments to be made for some of the things Michael Scott does. In any case, you get the idea. The nature of the relationship between these people is just one of many, many questions that we should be asking about how these folks come together. So how do we map this out? Well, let's start with the expanding this, zooming out a little bit on this map and adding in the message. So obviously a sender sends a message to the receiver, and that is these three components are probably the furthest that most people get before they take a class in communication or really sit down and think about communication in any systematic way. And certainly this is the way I thought about communication before I studied it in college and then in graduate school. Is, okay, I'm the sender, I'm going to send a message, I will send it to the receiver, and that is an act of communication. And those are certainly elements there, but one additional element that we want to throw on this map here is feedback. Feedback is the means by which a receiver gives the sender some idea about whether they've received the message, how they feel about the message, and any other important information. The model in the Newman book uses the term response. I think that's also a fine way to describe what's happening here, except that I think feedback is a little bit more all-encompassing because it's not just about the response to the message, it's also letting the sender know, is the receiver in a good place to receive the message? Is the receiver mentally present? Is the receiver in thinking about something else, distracted, etc.? And all of those are also very important questions. In any case, the cycle goes around over and over again. Now, all of this is based historically, at least in the history of communication studies, on oral or verbal communication, especially in the context of presentations or speeches. And so when you envision it that way, it is typically a little bit clearer because as the sender is speaking, every word, every sentence, every element of that message is being heard or not heard by the receiver, and as a speaker or as a presenter, you can use the nonverbal communication, the nonverbal cues from the receiver as feedback to tell you this is going well, this is going poorly, they're attentive, awake, and fully here, they're looking at their phone, they're distracted, they've got other things going on, and you can adapt in real time based on that feedback. That is, in the eyes of a lot of communication scholars, the purest or the simplest, or at least in a lot of ways the easiest to conceptualize, I should say, way to think about communication, because it's all happening live in real time. But also think about the different ways that you give feedback to other types of messages. So for instance, this is a video lecture I'm recording on my laptop at home so that I can post on YouTube, that will then be posted on Canvas, and you ideally are receiving this message but I don't know how that's being received based on your nonverbal communication. You're not either nodding or falling asleep or checking your phone. I have no idea how you're receiving this. And so I would actually really value you giving me a bit of feedback. Again, this is a good opportunity to practice slightly more formal email tone and say, Dear Dr. Herman or Professor Herman, I liked the lecture, I didn't like the lecture, I found the lecture perfectly mediocre, anything to that effect. If you want to give me any feedback on this presentation, then I would appreciate that, because otherwise I have no idea whether I'm succeeding here as a communicator. So the feedback does depend largely on the medium of the initial communication. Now I'm going to zoom this out a little bit more and talk about encoding and decoding. Before a sender can send a message, we can't simply plug my brain into your brain and have me deliver the contents of this lecture directly into your brain. We have to encode, I have to encode that message using the English language as a spoken form and encode the graphics into the PowerPoint slide deck so that you then get a message, and you then have to decode that message. You surely recognize that I'm not literally talking about circles and arrows, but that these circles and arrows are metaphors or indicators of a broader concept that I'm talking about, and you probably were decoding that fact without that part of the message without even really thinking about it. And when you send me feedback, you then would also have to take that idea of this is a good lecture, this is a bad lecture, this is an indifferent, this is a mediocre lecture, and encode that into a set of specific words to be sent in an email or a message on Canvas, and then I would have to decode those words and say, well, here's what student so-and-so thought of my lecture. So that encoding and decoding part is not covered in the Newman book, and I think is worth highlighting because that's often where miscommunication happens. I mean to say one kind of message, but between me, the sender, and the actual construction of the words that come out of my mouth or that come out of my fingertips as I'm typing or in whatever medium I'm using, and or between those actual written words and the potential recipient, there is an opportunity for miscommunication or misreading about what those words mean. I'm going to give you an example. I know a student who needed some assistance from an administrator at a college, not MSU Denver. People come out of the woodwork and ask me for help across all kinds of colleges because they know I work in colleges and know about colleges. So somebody that I know is at a different college and wrote to ask for help from an administrator. And the administrator had not gotten something to an additional party who needed to provide some information to help the student. Sorry, I'm being vague. There's some confidential details here, as you might imagine. And the student in the email to the administrator just simply laid out the facts. The other person who needs to receive an email from you has not received an email from you, was the thrust of that message. And the administrator that she sent that email to then took the time to call her and excoriate her, really, to criticize her pretty loudly for being hostile. That was a word that the initial recipient of that message, this university or this college administrator used, was, why did you have to send me a hostile email like that? And that's a good example, in my view, of the difference between the message that the sender was trying to encode and the message that the receiver decoded. I read the email. There was no overt hostility. There was no name calling or, do your job or anything to that effect. But because the receiver is an individual with subjective views and perspectives, they took a simple description of the facts as they were as a hostile message. And so somewhere between the encoding of that message and the decoding of that message, we got a genuine miscommunication. And that was unfortunate. And then the feedback that the student got was, I think, not a reasonable or fair reaction to the message that was sent. Now, I've alluded to this, and the Newman text alludes to this as well, but I just want to make this explicit in a way that is only implicit in the Newman diagram, which is that all of these messages have to happen in the place, in the context of a medium. A medium of communication is the means by which a message is sent and received. So the spoken word was the first medium of communication, and then since then we've developed the written word. Now we have, obviously, email and PowerPoint and video presentations and YouTube and Instagram and Snapchat and all of that. And so each of these different media, and this is let me make a quick aside here. You have, text is a medium. The singular of this concept is medium, and the plural is media, M-E-D-I-A. So verbal, written, and telephonic communication are three different media, and that's the plural that we would use there. Do not write mediums. Mediums tell you your fortune. The plural of medium is media. So the difference between media is incredibly important, as the Newman text goes into some detail later in this chapter, and as we'll talk about throughout the semester. But like I was talking about earlier, the feedback difference alone between a live in-class lecture and an asynchronous presentation recorded and then posted to YouTube is just impossible to overstate. I don't, as I'm lecturing, have any ability to adapt to your feedback and say, oh, this part's going well, or they've really got it, I can move on, I'm really talking too long about this, and so on. And as every element of the communication process changes dramatically as you go from medium to medium to medium. And that's even within different digital media. For instance, messaging someone via Instagram is a very different process and has a very different feel and a very different set of norms and expectations than sending someone an email, even though those are both something that you can do right from your smartphone. Now, I talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to really highlight this and make this explicit for you to all see. In the encoding and decoding process is really where we see the most communication barriers. Now, there will be communication barriers that are more specific to a sender or a receiver, more specific to a given message, or more specific to a given medium, but the fundamental breakdown of communication tends to happen between the sender and the message, or between the message and the receiver, or between the receiver and the feedback and the sender, those encoding and decoding steps. So when I put ideas to words in an in-person presentation and there's a really loud air conditioner going in the back of the room, then that's going to reduce the audience's ability to decode that message. That's a communication barrier. When I'm an administrator who's stressed out at the start of a school year, and the message that's sent to me is received in a context where I am that stressed and so on, there's gonna be a lot of opportunities for me to misread a very factual, no, really, please help me kind of email as being overtly hostile. So all those miscommunication problems come out because we have communication barriers that in some ways reduce our ability to encode and decode messages, even though some of those problems are more specific to some of these other elements, such as the sender, message, receiver, feedback, or maybe even the context. All of this happens within a given context. So a lecture within a classroom, the classroom provides the context. But the classroom is also within the context of the specific college or university that you're in. It's in the context of, is it the morning or the afternoon or the evening? Is it a warm day, a cold day, a rainy day, a dry day? Right? We all bring 1,000 different variables with us into every single communication environment, and those variables of the broader context shape all of the different ways that these elements come together. Some of the other elements of context that you're going to want to think about are what is the culture that you are in. So, for instance, some cultures stand really far apart from each other when you're having one-on-one oral communication, and some cultures stand really close to each other. So if you are from a culture where people tend to stand really pretty far apart from each other, such as the United States, and you go to another country such as say Egypt, where people stand really close to each other, and you start trying to talk to someone from really far away, and they start trying to talk to you from really close, well, the context that you're in a country where people talk really close is going to be a really important factor that you're going to have to take into account. If you are if you're in a culture where people are really more formal, such as a German culture is very formal relative to a much more informal American culture, right? That's going to change your ability to communicate with someone from that culture, especially if you're there versus if you're here. If you're in Germany and the German people that you're talking to are used to a German context, which is a really formal context, versus if they're here and they're becoming used to or they expect a more informal context, that also will shape your abilities to communicate with each other depending on how you adapt to those various contexts. We'll talk about a lot of those specific examples in the context of examples like that, at least in the context of intercultural communication. But cultural context is just one huge element of context. Another is just the broader environment, what's going on in the world. For instance, right now, obviously, every act of communication that happens in the United States is shaped by the fact that we have an ongoing pandemic, thanks to COVID-19. So that context will make some communication acts that would have been pretty ordinary in pretty ordinary times seem extraordinary, seem potentially more hostile or more caring, will just shape all of the ways that we communicate with each other in 1,000 ways that are sometimes hard to predict and sometimes leads to miscommunication, especially in a less productive way because everyone's kind of stressed out and anxious about what's going on. The book adds one element that I might not add myself, but I'm going to put it in here just to make sure that we're all on the same page, so to speak, and that's communication need. Now, any given sender can have any of a number of potential communication needs, whether that's going to a supervisor to explain how a given project is going, or that you have an idea for a new project or a client that you could go pitch to, or all of the other reasons that you could go talk to a supervisor, or a supervisor might have the communication need to go to talk to a supervisee to say, hey, when you do XYZ process, instead of doing it the way you did it, you need to do it this other way, and here's what that looks like. And here's where you find that in the training manual or in the operations manual, or here's how you go talk to ask for more help. And so the communication need or the motivation for engaging in any given act of communication is also an important consideration here, and I think implicitly a lot of communication models just have that built into the sort of sender circle or the idea of what the sender is doing here. But I actually like that the book breaks that out as a separate part of the model, and therefore wanted to add it to my little separate visualization here. Well, I hope this has added some clarity to all of the elements that go into the communication process as laid out in the Newman book. It's a little bit different here, especially if you can compare and contrast the way I do it versus the way the book does it. I think that you'll get actually some additional clarity just by having a slightly different, almost like a stereo vision, like a slightly different way to look at the same thing. So, but if you have any other questions, or if this is unclear, or you're just completely lost, or if you think this is helpful, please do send me some feedback. I really value feedback from my students. I am new to teaching asynchronous remote classes. This is my first time doing that, and so I look forward to you helping me get better at that. And please do give me feedback especially as encouraged previously, in email form, and try to use this as an opportunity to use a slightly more formal tone, but not because I demand formality, but really just so that you can get some of that good practice in. And I will look forward to talking at you a little bit more with an additional lecture in Chapter 1 here soon.